Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Four Corners or Southwest Drought webinar. My name is Elizabeth Waite. I work with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. I'm the regional coordinator for the Intermountain West and Southern Plains Drought Early Warning System. This webinar series was initiated due to the severity of the drought in the Southwest region. We're trying to provide the most recent information on the drought and impacts of the drought, including wildfire, and forecasts and outlooks looking into the future. We have two presenters today. One is Brian Fuchs. He's a climatologist with the National Drought Mitigation Center. And the second presenter will be Ed Delgado, who's the National Program Manager for Predictive Services at the National Interagency Fire Center. After Brian and Ed do their presentations, Emily Elias, the Director of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, will lead the Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free during or at the end of the webinar to type them into the question box that's to the right in the panel of your GoToWebinar control panel. So go ahead and type in questions when you have them, and Emily will help direct those questions to folks who can answer them. And then Andrea Baer, the National Weather Service Western Region Coordinator, will wrap up the webinar at 2 p.m. I just wanted to say this webinar series is a really collaborative effort. We've had contributions from many, many experts across the Southwest region, including the state climatologists of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, the National Weather Service, USDA, NOAA's Regional Climate Services Director, CLIMAS at the University of Arizona, Western Water Assessment at University of Colorado, extension agents, and many other contributors. So I wanted to thank everybody for your time and effort in putting this together to provide as much good quality, up-to-date information as we possibly can. I also want to let you know that the next webinar will be held late June, and Becky Bollinger, the Assistant State Climatologist of Colorado, will be presenting then, and I'll send out more information on that webinar. We're thinking June 25th, but I'll definitely send out more details later. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Brian Fuchs to give the presentation. Thank you, Brian. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone, depending on where you're at in the country and the time zone. Really glad to have you with us this afternoon. And one thing that we have definitely been seeing as the drought has continued to entrench itself in the region is people have become not only more aware, if they haven't been, but also a little bit more concerned. The media has definitely started to pick up on some of the stories and some of the impacts already. So it's a good opportunity to not only get an update of not only how we got here, where we're currently at, but also where we think we're going in the next several months as well. So that's what I'm going to focus on today with my portion of the presentation, is really talking about some of those issues that we're already encountering, where we're at, how we got here, but also where do we think that we're going to be in the next several months. And so again, my name is Brian Fuchs. I am a climatologist with the National Drought Mitigation Center, and we are at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I am also one of the U.S. Drought Monitor authors, and so I typically will pay pretty close attention to what's going on all across the country as far as the drought situation. Today I'm going to cover the drought status, the meteorological and climatological conditions and indicators that have put us in the situation that we're in right now, the outlook through the summer, and also going to be touching on impacts mainly on water supply. And then at the end, I will pass it over to Ed Delgado to talk more about the wildfire situation. So just to start off today, I'm a firm believer that pictures do indeed say a thousand words. And some of the images that have been coming out of the Four Corners region have been very stark, very much attention getting, and very sad in many ways as well. So I just want to share some of these. I apologize that some of them are quite graphic with some of the animal death, but they are representative of what's going on in the region. To start off with, we had these images come across of hundreds of dead horses around a dried out waterbed. Some of them got stuck in the mud, couldn't escape. Some of them basically succumbed to thirst in the area that in northeast Arizona. And this was well covered and documented. It was on the Navajo Nation. And what we also saw were other images, not just this one, but of these dried out water holes out in this region where just no water available and actual substantial loss of life coming from this situation. Again, just one of many impacts that are being experienced, but very concerning in that, especially for the wild horses in the region, they have really built up a resiliency to some of these weather patterns that they experience, from both wet and dry patterns, hot and cold, etc. And to see those types of animals succumbing to the drought conditions already is alarming. Again, there are some domesticated species that have also been impacted, but really concerning out of the region. And just had some photographs shared with me yesterday by Zach Schwab from the Colorado Climate Center. And he had been on a road trip through the Four Corners region and in southwest Colorado. And I think these are really good to share, especially when we start looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor map and seeing extreme and exceptional drought on the map. What does that look like? And especially for someone who's out on the plains like myself, to see some of these images, it does, again, it paints a picture and it really says a lot. So the picture on the left was east of Four Corners, the completely, hardly any green at all in that photograph of the landscape. And these are in areas that are showing D4 or exceptional drought, a 1 in 50 year type of drought event on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And then the photo on the right is over by Shiprock, New Mexico, and even the scrub type weeds along the edge of the road, very little green in there. And as you look, if you were a livestock producer, there's not much for any forage at all out there. Then as Zach went further to the east back into Colorado and got into the San Juan Mountains, these pictures are in an area that we have categorized as D3 right now, and right on the fringe of D4. And you look at them, especially that photograph on the left, there is a lot of green. It looks like a fairly lush meadow situation. And the key, and I think I agree with what Zach stated about this picture, is that it's green right now, but if you look up into the higher elevations, there's not much snow left at all up there. And pretty much any moisture that's coming from those upper elevations into this snow melt fed meadow has already happened. And without precipitation, the conditions of this area are going to go down quite rapidly and substantially in a hurry, especially if we see temperatures go up. And then Red Mountain Pass south of Ouray, Colorado, again, most of the snowpack is completely gone already. And so we're at, today's the 23rd of May. Typically, we will see snowpack in these upper elevations well into June, depending on the year. And so it really does tell us what kind of year we did have this year, where especially through the San Juans, definitely did not see close to normal snowpack at all. And I will touch on some more information related to that. But I just think, seeing what D4 potentially can look like on a landscape, and even what D3 is looking like on a landscape, it does help us get a better idea of what we're looking for as far as potential impacts and what's the landscape look like when we get into these situations. Some of the media, again, have been picking up on this. So we've been hearing stories of water getting hauled, talking about the monsoon season already and what could happen with heavy rains, and are we going to see an active monsoon season? Also seeing some information about well levels dropping in portions of Arizona, and giving an explanation as to why. And again, this hope for the monsoon season. These are just some media headlines that have come out here in just the last week or so. And so where are we? So this is the U.S. Drought Monitor that was released last Thursday for the May 15th time period. And we will have a new map that comes out tomorrow. And what I can say is there are going to be some changes in the region. So tomorrow morning, hot off the press, look at the new drought monitor map from Eric Lubyhusen at USDA, and we're going to see some changes again in the region. But you know, the Four Corners region definitely has been one of the harder hit regions in the Southwest. We can see that broad area of D4 in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. And then that D4 is extending through northern New Mexico, catching parts of southern Colorado as well, into Texas and the Oklahoma panhandles, as well as southwest Kansas. And this area has been quite dry for quite some time now, and I'm going to actually show some of the numbers associated with that as we go forward. We can zoom into the region here and look at the Southwest as a whole. And currently we have 68% of that region in drought. 51.44% of that region is in severe drought or worse, and a third of the region right now is in extreme drought or worse. So we are seeing about 30% of the Southwest in red, and that's everything from Southern California into New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, not quite clipping any of Nevada quite yet. Just under 7% of the region is showing D4 drought right now. And so when we compare that to where we were at some different time frames, you know, right now we are, like I said, 68% of the region in drought. The start of the water year at the beginning of last October, we were only seeing 5% of the region in drought. A year ago, we were only seeing about a little over 7.5% of the region in drought. So definitely in the last 12 months, we've been on this pattern where conditions have dried out. We haven't seen much relief through last summer or into the winter months, and here we are going into the summer of 2018 with over 2/3 of the region already in drought. So that's alarming to say the least. And here's just the map of where we were at the beginning of the water year. You can see that outside of Southern California and Southern Arizona and a pocket of east central Utah and west central Colorado, as well as some in the interior of Utah, there was very little drought in the region to speak of. Again, just 5% of the region had any type of drought showing, and very little areas showing abnormally dry conditions. So going back to the beginning of our current water year, really weren't overly concerned about the drought situation in this region, other than the forecast even at that time was showing that we probably were going to see conditions dry out, and that forecast did verify with how we'd seen the winter and into spring develop. So one thing we have with the U.S. Drought Monitor map is what we call our change maps. And so we can pick various time scales and show how the Drought Monitor map has changed, either improving or degrading over that time. And so this is showing from last October. So basically for the current water year, we can see again this 4 to 5 class degradation throughout the Southwest has already occurred. And then I drew that red line in there, and it really seems like if you're east of that line, except for some of south central Texas, conditions haven't been that bad since the start of the water year. Actually quite wet in some areas. But you go west of that line, there is just a really tight gradient of areas that have not received adequate precipitation, and we've shown those changes with drought developing on the drought monitor map. In those areas that have had adequate moisture, and we haven't had much of a drought signal at all. So that really is a stark contrast, and the changes have been alarming and also quite rapidly as far as drought goes. So to talk about some of the current conditions, I just pulled up the precipitation over the last 7 days using the AHAPS-based precipitation estimates that come from the National Weather Service River Forecast Centers. And you can see that parts of eastern New Mexico into Colorado, especially northeast Colorado, some of those areas did pick up some fairly good thunderstorm rains in the last 7 days and really helped settle the dust, so to speak, on the plains areas of those states. But as you get into the elevations and out of those foothill regions, you can see that the precipitation did drop off quite substantially, and even parts of western New Mexico, most of Arizona, southern Utah, they didn't pick up any kind of precipitation, and that's shown in that percent of normal precipitation on the right-hand side. And one thing that really can steer your eyes in a hurry is when you look at that percent of normal precipitation for the last week, all those areas that are in any shade of yellow, orange, or red were below normal for the week. And as you look through the region, we don't see very many areas at all that are gray, green, blue, or purple outside of those areas that saw the most substantial precipitation. So again, even in some of the areas that picked up some lighter precipitation, it was well below normal for what we would expect for this time of year. So starting to look at some of the precipitation statistics, we can see the calendar year percent of normal precipitation for this region, and the dark reds are less than 25% of normal. The brighter reds are 50 to 70% of normal, and then that moderate red, kind of the maroon red, is 25 to 50% of normal. And as you can see from West Texas and Oklahoma through most of New Mexico and Arizona and the southern reaches of Colorado and Utah, almost all those areas had 70% or less of normal precipitation since the beginning of January. In many areas, you're seeing below that 50 and even 25% of normal. If we go back to the last 6 months, which takes us to about the end of November, we can see that same kind of pattern, and we even lose some of the precipitation. If we go back, we can see some of those areas that maybe the percent of normal was not so bad, maybe 70 to 80% of normal. But then when we go to the last 6 months, almost all the areas less than 50% of normal, with even more areas less than 25% of normal precipitation. Especially, again, I really focus in on that Four Corners region into the areas to the south where it has been the driest. And then we go back and look at the water year. And at this point in time, we don't see anything in Arizona, Southern California, Southern Nevada, very small pocket of some precipitation in far southern New Mexico that was above normal. And until you get into the center of Colorado even, you're not seeing hardly any of these areas that had a water that for the current water year are above normal precipitation. And in fact, most of these areas are less than 50% of normal precipitation for the current water year. And that doesn't really bode too well for us when we know that the winter months are important precipitation accumulation period for us. And there's quite a long time between the end of the winter and when the monsoon can potentially help us. So another way of looking at this information, and this is something that we do quite a bit with the drought monitor, is knowing the percent of normal precipitation is helpful, but it doesn't put it into a historical perspective. And that's where the Standardized Precipitation Index, or the SPI, really can do that. That it will tell you how your current conditions are compared to the entire record for that region. And so when you start seeing areas that are in that -1 to -1.5, we typically classify that as moderate to severe drought. And as we get to those -2s to -2.5 to -3, those are fairly significant drought events. And that just tells you that you're 2.5 to 3 standard deviations away from normal precipitation during that given time frame. So for the year to date, or the calendar year, we are seeing some of these pockets in New Mexico, in the San Juans, going into southwest Colorado and southeast Utah, and in portions of central and southern Arizona, where we definitely are seeing 2 to 2.5 deviations away from normal precipitation during this time. And that 6-month time frame, again, we lose some of that moisture that we had in the early part of fall. And we're starting to see even more widespread -2 to 2.5 standard deviations away from normal precipitation, and go for that water year again. And we can see that it is quite substantial through the region. The portions of southwest Colorado really stand out, as well as north central New Mexico, south central Colorado, and in the interior of Arizona, some of those areas are just really, for the water year, seeing near record dryness, if not even record dryness for that time frame. And so how large of a precipitation deficit does exist for the current water year? So when I pull up the data for the current water year and look at the departure of normal precipitation, we can see that through a lot of Arizona, we're 5 to 10 inches below normal just since last October. Again, that area of southwest Colorado stands out as well, as 5 to 10 inches below normal. And even as we get up closer to Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Range, we can see some of the same types of conditions. We're 5 to 10 inches below normal for that time frame. And you see almost the entire region dominated by the yellow colors as well. And so that's saying that almost everywhere is below normal. The yellows are 0 to 5 inches below normal just for the current water year. And if we go back a little bit further, so we take this back to the last 12 months. So we're going from last May to this current May. And we can see, again, some of these pockets really start developing in like the Salt River Basin in Arizona, 8 to 12 inches below normal. Southwest Colorado stands out, again, through the Wasatch Range into Salt Lake City, 4 to 8, 8 to 12 inches below zero. And just because I went all the way back 2 years. And what we're seeing here and what I've been realizing is even as dry as it's been since the current water year started, this dryness in the region has not been something that just developed in last year, but it has been over the last year to 2 years. As the deficits over the last 24 months, again, some of those areas in Arizona, New Mexico, and southwest Colorado are 12 to 16 inches below normal. And again, that really doesn't tell us a whole lot. What does that mean? But when you start looking at what average annual precipitation is for some of these areas, I'm going to pick out that area far southwest Colorado, where you're only looking at 5 to maybe 10 to 15 inches of precipitation for the given year. And you go back one slide and look, some of these areas are 8 to 12, 12 to 16 inches below normal. When you go forward again, that's almost an entire year's worth of precipitation that has not occurred in some of these areas. And that we can look through the region as a whole and see many examples like this as to why the problems we're seeing, as well as the impacts that are already being experienced. It's really because we, over the last year to 2 years, much of this region has been quite dry, and we're starting to see the accumulation of that dryness as the drought has rapidly developed here over the last 6 to 8 months. Temperatures have not helped at all during this situation either. They're contributing to the above normal water demand and water usage. And so as we can see, since last October to present, anywhere from 2 to 4 over a lot of the region, 4 to 6 degrees above normal, and even pockets in Colorado were 6 to 8 degrees above normal since last October. So that also tells you something else. Even in those higher elevations, if you're that warm, it's very tough to accumulate snowfall unless you're at those highest peaks. So that also means that a lot of the precipitation that did fall through the winter months either fell as liquid to begin with and never was snow. And so basically we had runoff and evaporation taking place immediately, but also we only saw snow at those highest elevations. So it's again where we're seeing these dry conditions, the temperatures have also been well above normal through the current water year. Another tool that we like to look at is this Vegetation Drought Response Index, which was developed here at the National Drought Mitigation Center with USGS and some other partners. And you can really see that when we dial into the Southwest, that Four Corners region almost looks like a bullseye of where vegetation conditions and where vegetation is being impacted the most due to drought is right over that region. And when I zoom into that area even more, it really lines up quite well with some of the areas that have also been the driest over this time. So we are seeing the satellite-based products, which VegDry is, which covers this area in a very high resolution, picking up some of these areas where the dryness is showing extreme drought type of conditions, if not severe drought. And that will also lead into some of what Ed will be talking about as far as fire danger when I get done. So what we can do now is go into the temperature and precipitation outlooks as far as determining where we think we're going to be going. And I got this photo from Dave Dubois, the New Mexico State climatologist, showing some dry stock tanks. And typically you would hope to see water in the bottom of those, and basically they are completely dry with some light green in the middle where the water last accumulated. And that's problematic for livestock producers, or as well as any of the wildlife in that region. Very little available and open water holes for animals to get any moisture from. So over the next 8 to 14 days, temperatures outlook is on the left and precipitation outlook is on the right. I'll start with the temperature. And through the region, we are seeing that we have an above probability of above normal temperatures over the next 8 to 14 days. Pretty much the entire country is seeing that. And just before I got on this call, I had a email come from another drought monitor out there, and he's been following the May temperatures across the CONUS and said that we're well on track to having the warmest May ever in the United States as a whole. So that's something that this outlook is definitely, as it takes us through the end of May and into the first part of June, definitely are seeing that in the forecast. Precipitation on the right, there is opportunity for above normal chances of above normal precipitation through portions of Colorado and northern New Mexico and into Utah during this time frame, and near normal opportunities in the areas that are in gray. So we'll have to watch this. Again, a lot of this has been in the form of convective thunderstorms. And so we'll see if those thunderstorms do pop up. And the bad thing about that this time of year is they are widely scattered. So we don't get these large, all-encompassing precipitation events that cover a lot of area. It's usually hit and miss. And so you may get under a nice rain shower, but your neighbor 10 miles away may not see anything. And that does make it harder for widespread improvement or even easing of drought conditions with that type of rain. The June temperature and precipitation outlook. So this is just for the month of June. Again, we see temperatures on the left and precipitation on the right. So that signal of above normal chances of above normal temperatures is quite entrenched in the Southwest, with the areas of Arizona and New Mexico and southern Utah and Colorado having the strongest signal in the lower 48. And for precipitation, equal chances. So that's saying that there is not a strong signal one way or the other during the month of June of above or below normal precipitation probabilities. So looks like warm conditions in the month of June, above normal conditions continuing out of the month of May, with the opportunities of equal chances of above or below normal precipitation. And then as we get into the summer, so this is looking at June, July, and August, and we can continue to see that signal in the Southwest. It started extending a little bit more to the north and west during the summer months. Fairly good probability of above normal chances of above normal temperatures through pretty much the western half of the U.S., with the strongest signal again in the Southwest Four Corners region. But we start seeing this signal too over the interior Rocky Mountains of above normal chances of above normal precipitation during June, July, August. And that does reach into New Mexico and Arizona with the strongest signal along the Colorado and Utah border. So we'll have to continue watching this. And then I went out one more month. So this is the July, August, September, and this is what we would really consider our monsoon season. And we continue to see that above normal chances of above normal temperatures in the western U.S. kind of extend out of the southwest and more into the Intermountain West and Great Basin regions with those highest probabilities. And we start seeing that signal for above normal chances of above normal precipitation kind of expand from what we saw. So we'll go back here to June, July, August, and you can see that strongest signal along the Colorado-Utah border. We see that really expand during the July, August, September timeframe, and we see that wetter than normal probability. That signal expands as well, covering much of Arizona, western New Mexico, almost all of Utah, much of Colorado, up into Wyoming. So this is in direct response to the idea that the monsoon signal is fairly robust this year. Now, for anyone who's been in the Southwest for any period of time, they're going to realize that the monsoon is a seasonal type of phenomena, and some years it is offset east or west. Sometimes it starts later, it starts sooner. And so what we're going to have to see is will this signal verify? And I think a lot of eyes are really focused on that July, August, September period to see what the monsoon does for us this year. The seasonal drought outlook came out just last Thursday as well. It takes us through the end of August of this year. And right now we are seeing that just a small area of along the Colorado and Utah border is showing that drought is going to remain, but maybe improve for much of the Southwest and Four Corners region. We're looking at drought persisting through this time frame, and it is picking up on some of that signal that we're seeing, especially in that 8 to 14 day period of the wetter conditions over portions of eastern New Mexico and eastern Colorado. But then again, we see some of that area of South Texas with drought developing as well. So it's one of those things that I think we're really going to have to watch and see what goes on this summer, if we're going to see drought easing at all by the time we get to the end of August, or are we going to really need to go all the way into September before we get the full breadth of what the monsoon season will bring to the region. The other thing you may have been hearing about is this potential shift to El Nino that is potentially coming in the fall. And so right now, if you look at the graphic on the left, the lower left, we can see that the probabilities of El Nino in the red bars steadily increase through the winter months. And so the last bar is the January, February, March timeframe. And so we are seeing that we have by November almost a 60% probability, and by December, January, February, that's up to about a 65% probability of El Nino developing in the Pacific, which in turn would impact and influence our weather patterns through the southwestern U.S. And we can see the IRI CPC graphic as well. These are looking at sea surface temperatures. Currently, we're at about a minus half a degree Celsius in the ENSO region of the Pacific, and we see that steadily increasing again as we get to that November, December, January type of time frame, where we're almost at a full degree warmer than normal, a degree Celsius that is, during that time frame. And then the top graphic on the top of the slide, you can see that the areas in red are during El Nino events, and those in blue are La Niñas. And so we have been in this fairly extended La Niña pattern, at least the cooler than normal oceanic temperatures, even if we've gone away from official La Niña signal or categorization. And so we're looking to see these reverse here as we get towards the end of summer and into the first part of winter. So what does that mean for the region? When we start talking about El Nino, I've circled the area that we're probably most concerned about. We really are going to watch where that Pacific jet sets up and where the storm track sets up. Many times you hear of the El Nino winters in California really changing their situation and breaking their drought patterns. But it's also a wet signal over the southwestern U.S. as well. And typically we will see that storm track and storm pattern change, so where you see a wetter signal from about Northern California all through the southern tier of the United States into the Gulf Coast area. And so that's really what we can be watching to see if it develops, as we are seeing the first models show that it will. And typically also the most favorable thing about this is when you have El Nino conditions in the winter months, that tends to be where we have the strongest analogs, meaning that what we know as climate scientists, with El Nino, the strongest signals are associated with the winter months. So this is something to pay attention to as well. I'll quickly get into some of the water supply information. So here's the stream flow forecast coming from the NRCS as of May 1st. You can see that all those areas in the dark maroonish, brownish reds are showing less than 25% of stream flow anticipated through the spring and summer. The brighter reds are in that 25 to 49%. So pretty much when you go into New Mexico, western and southern Colorado, almost all of Utah, you're not seeing any anticipated stream flows that are going to be even at that 50th percentile. And when we pull up the Colorado, Rio Grande, and Arkansas River basins, you can see that information just dialed in a little bit more. The upper reaches of some of those basins, definitely, especially on the upper Colorado, we're seeing a little bit better signal. But on the Rio Grande and Arkansas, not so much. And this came out of May 19th water supply forecast discussion from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center that was sent to me, and a couple things really caught my eye, and I kind of bolded them in that second paragraph. Was just some of these areas that we're seeing are in their second or third lowest on record. And just something that, again, when you start talking about the historical range of some of these products and how far back they go, we are reaching some of those critical, significant low readings, low flows on these basins. And also the information on Lake Powell and the current inflows at 3 million acre feet, or 42% of average. And the forecast for Lake Powell is the fifth lowest on record, dating back to the 1964 timeframe. So we are seeing, again, that it's not just a small portion of the region, but as we've seen through the winter months, a large portion of the region did not accumulate the snowpack that was anticipated or expected, and that's going to resonate throughout the entire region. And these are, again, just some of the forecast volumes, the 50% exceedance probability that came out of the NRCS in May. And again, some of those are 0 to 12.5% probability in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and most of Utah. And looking at the adjusted volume for the water year, going through the end of April, and again, just those low readings have been persistent through much of the Four Corners region. Some of the regional impacts, again, the Colorado River peak low and early. We're just seeing that surge of water associated with the melt-off of snow has already occurred in most instances, and we're seeing already steady declines. Water restrictions coming, the story at the lower left was coming out of Telluride, talking about how they're already trying to conserve water and having some restrictions on refilling of swimming pools and hot tubs. The Pecos River in eastern New Mexico, the USGS measured it at 21.5 cubic feet per second, about a 16th of the mean, which is typically 339 cubic feet per second for May 15th. Further downstream at Anton Chico, no flow was recorded on that date. So we're already seeing some of these rivers and streams not only have fairly substantial record low flows, but also drying up. And the comment from the New Mexico Game and Fish on that lower right panel, it's just not the Pecos, but it's all over New Mexico. So again, this isn't just a small regional type of impact that we're experiencing, but is something that we're already seeing through much of the region and will continue to see develop as we move forward through much of the summer. So with that, we'll hold off on questions to the end. I'm going to pass over the slides to Ed Delgado to talk about the fire danger in the region, and I'll gladly take your questions that you have for me after Ed gets done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. You covered some of the things that are relevant to my discussion, so that was good planning on your part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2018 fire season, where we are right now, and what we expect to happen over the next few months. As Brian pointed out, it's been very, very dry. This first slide is just kind of a quick overview of what we've seen the last couple of decades across the United States. The red line is the acres burned each year, and the yellow line is number of fires we've had. And you can see an interesting trend there. The number of fires is slowly trending downward, but the number of acres is going up quite rapidly over the last 25, 28 years. So we don't expect this to change anytime soon. You can make your own conclusions about what that means. But just wanted to kind of put fire seasons over the years into perspective before I go into this year. So as Brian pointed out, it's been very dry in the Southwest, and I'm basically duplicating some of his slides here. You can see the red areas down in Arizona, New Mexico, up into Colorado and parts of Utah. In particular, I selected these three because in fire, what's really important to us is the timing of precipitation, because that drives the growth of the vegetation that eventually could become fuel for fires. And you see over the last 3 months, it's been quite dry at almost all of these time steps. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, a lack of rainfall prevents a lot of what we call fine fuels, the grasses and the brush, from growing, which eliminates some of that. And that's the fuel type that generally ignites and carries fire. It helps it spread. But on the other side of that same coin, this dryness affects the larger fuels like trees and timber. And the longer they go without water, the more stressed they become. In some cases, you can see increases in tree mortality, and then that becomes fuel for fire. And those are the types of fuels that can burn very intensely and oftentimes can lead to some pretty disastrous fires across the West. So this kind of sets the stage for that. As Brian pointed out, this dryness has exceeded 2 years now in the Southwest, and with a continuation of it this year. As we're getting out of the spring season, we're getting out of that favorable rain season. So for the next 2 to 3 months, until we start to see signs of the monsoon pushing into the Southwest, we're not likely going to see much precipitation to help mitigate some of the conditions that we see right now. A quick look at snowpack for the West. On the left, you see the snowpack at the end of May across the West. You can see quite a good snowpack in the higher elevations. There's still a lot of snow left over in the mountains toward the end of May last year, as we had a rather mild spring. But this year is quite a different picture, with virtually all the West except the far northern Rockies and the far northwest part of western parts of Washington, the Cascades, are all well below normal. In some cases, they don't even have snow anymore in basically the southern half of the western United States. And that's important for us too, because now that all that snowpack is gone, we don't have any moisture left, and the fuels are now starting to dry out earlier than we normally would expect. So the consequence of that is we potentially have an earlier start to fire season. Things dry out sooner and become more receptive to ignition as we get into the warmer months of the late spring and early summer. Just another way of looking at this, this is soil moisture. The top one is the ranking by percentile. The lower right is the anomaly, how much is missing from what normally would expect this time of year. And you can see both of them are in the red across Arizona, Southern California, and all across the Four Corners region. So there's not a lot of moisture left in the ground to be able to keep vegetation alive, or at least out of dormancy. And again, another critical factor that we pay attention to with fire. You saw the drought already. Obviously, the area of concern for us is where it's been driest, and that long-term drought further exacerbates the situation with the larger fuels. The long-term drought stresses those and makes them more receptive to fire when it's introduced on the landscape. Fuel conditions, the top two are what we call dead fuel moistures. 100-hour is roughly 4 days. The 1,000-hour is roughly 40 days. It shows this is basically a measure of how vegetation responds, gets into equilibrium with the surrounding environment. And you see that the large area of red across the Southwest for both of them, that's important again, because it tells us that a lot of the larger fuels are dried out, and those are the ones that burn hotter and for a longer period of time. And because they can burn to extreme levels, they can be more catastrophic the longer the conditions are there. The bottom left is the Keach-Byram index. It's a measure of how much moisture is in the ground, and you can see the big dry area in the southern part of Arizona. And then you saw this one in Brian's presentation, the Vegetation Drought Response Index. And of course, that area around the Four Corners through Arizona are areas that we're very concerned about. And in particular, an area that we see a lot of fire in these dry conditions is that Mogollon Rim that runs through from northwest Arizona up around the Grand Canyon down toward the central Arizona-New Mexico border. You can see that has peaked at one of the more dry categories. And that's an area where we get a lot of lightning as we start seeing thunderstorms develop in the Southwest, and we get a lot of fire there. And with the forest there in such bad shape, there's a potential for a lot of fire in that region. And looking at the latest fuel information from the Southwest, those are some of the areas that have the highest fire danger right now going into the summer months. So an area of concern for us, as well as the whole Southwest region. Just wanted to give you a current status. This is what we have right now. You may remember about in March, we had a lot of fire across Texas and Oklahoma, parts of Kansas, into eastern New Mexico and southeastern Colorado. Those were largely driven by the very dry grass conditions across the plains. Those fires typically are driven by wind, so you see a lot of acreage in a short amount of time. And once they started to get precipitation, particularly the rain that they got last week, we're starting to see some green up in some of the grasses there, and the increase in the moisture in the soils. That's helped mitigate some of that fire threat. So we don't expect to see a lot more of that going on east of the Continental Divide, so basically eastern New Mexico into Texas and Oklahoma. But as Brian pointed out, we do have very poor precipitation west of the Rockies, and you see some of the fires that we have now. We just had that buzzard fire. We're putting a team on it today. It's a fire that we're concerned with, and we'll start to see more fires pick up there as we see more and more convection developing. In the short-term conditions, we have another closed low that's moving onshore going into the weekend that typically produces a lot of wind. And with the dry conditions down there, any ignitions we get are likely to spread very rapidly in the dry and windy conditions that we're expecting there over the weekend. So an area of concern in the short term as well as the longer term period. Just to give you an idea for the year, the Great Basin, which is essentially Utah, Nevada, and southern Idaho, and of course Southwest, which is Arizona, New Mexico. You can see Arizona, New Mexico has had just over 300,000 acres burned so far this year. That's about normal for them, but we're just getting into the core of their fire season, so we expect those numbers are going to increase rapidly. Nationally, at the bottom, you can see that we burned about almost 1.7 million acres. A lot of that was in the southern area, which is basically the Gulf states up into the Appalachian states. They burn a lot of acreage there. They get a lot of fires, and so they tend to burn a lot of acres in the winter and early spring. And that's why we see those numbers a little bit above normal for the 10-year average, even though we're seeing the number of fires is about average with respect to the 10-year average. But we do anticipate Southwest area over the next few weeks is going to start to see more fire and certainly more acres burned than that. So some of the key points, obviously we're monitoring the drought conditions, trying to keep track of where it's worsening, where we might see some mitigation from any type of precipitation events. The fuels in that region are extremely dry. Some areas of southeastern and central Utah, and of course parts of central Arizona and western New Mexico, are approaching some of their record highs for fire danger early in the year, which is something that's another big red flag for us. We have seen some short spikes in fire activity across the Southwest the last few weeks. But the weather pattern hasn't been sufficient to sustain those over long periods of time. But as we get out of the typical precipitation season from the early spring, transition into the summer, we're going to see less of these cool events and more chance of the hot, dry conditions that usually carry fire for a longer period of time, and also make some of the fires harder to manage. So the risk across the Southwest continues elevated and is likely to be that way until sometime in early July, when we start to see signals of the monsoon setting up across the Southwest. Our current projections, as Bryant stated, we're looking for about an average onset in early July of the monsoon into Arizona and New Mexico, and then progressing northward through the month up toward the southern Great Basin, Utah, southern Nevada. But as Brian pointed out, the monsoon sometimes can shift a little east, it can shift a little west, and depending on what pattern we get, parts of that region that we're concerned with may not get sufficient rainfall to really mitigate the conditions there, as you typically would expect with the monsoon. And another concern too, from the climate outlook, as you recall, Brian pointed out that CPC has outlooked high probability of above normal conditions, above normal temperatures across the Great Basin up toward Northern California and Southern Oregon. Those are also areas of that we're monitoring. And as the monsoon pushes in, the leading edge of that deeper moisture typically produces a lot of thunderstorm activity, but doesn't bring the precipitation with it. And as that gets into Utah and parts of southern Nevada, depending on how the monsoon lines up, we could see a lot of fire activity in those regions as well. So the monsoon isn't necessarily a sure bet to end the fire season across the Southwest and Four Corners region. A lot of it depends on how it lines up and just where the leading edge of that sits with respect to the fuel conditions that we're seeing right now. So there's still a lot of kind of wait and see how things develop and to be able to fine tune our outlooks. And so speaking of our outlook, this is our current outlook. We're going to start working on the next month's outlook tomorrow. But you see for May, we have that western New Mexico, eastern Arizona, and into the parts of Colorado and Utah that are still at a high fire danger. And again, that's very indicative of the conditions we've seen there with the precipitation deficits and the fuel conditions and the long-term drought that they've seen in some of those timbered areas. And that's going to continue into June, especially as we get hotter and drier and get away from the last vestiges of spring precipitation. We're likely to see a lot more convection, which produces little rainfall, but does produce lightning, which of course is a big fire starter in that region. And then as we get into July, we anticipate that the monsoon, maybe not so much precipitation, but certainly the increase in humidity will mitigate a lot of the fire starting conditions across the Four Corners region. And we'll get back into a normal fire regime where you get some fires, but it's not a lot of fire and not the kind of fires that last for long, long periods of time. a little bit easier to manage those fires and get around them. But then, of course, the fire season shifts more toward the west and the north as you get into July and August. So looking at the Southwest, another couple of months of critical conditions, and then tending to normalize as we get into July and August for that region. So that's all I have, and we'll take any questions you might have for us.
Okay,
Thanks very much, Dr. Delgado and Dr. Fuchs, for your presentations. And if anyone has questions for either of the presenters, please go ahead and put them into the question box. The first one that we have here is actually around water. It's whether or not a water agreement between the states is being modified to ensure water will be shared equally among the states. And this is opportunity for me to say that we will have another webinar on June 25th. And in the future, we're planning to focus specifically on water, but I will say that most of the adjustments to water management will happen at a local level. There are ditches that have agreed to go through some water shortage so that everyone can share in that water shortage. And there are some water masters that have agreed not to penalize people for not using their water this year under the prior appropriation doctrine. So the next question is for both Dr. Fuchs and Dr. Delgado. And the question is, last fall, as the Pacific Ocean went into La Nina conditions, were you nervous about this upcoming precipitation in this season?
Well, this is Brian. I'll take a first stab at that. And yes, when we were going into that situation and knowing also what the analog means for La Nina, which is typically drier in the southern part of the U.S., knowing how weak some of the monsoon season had been and seeing some of the areas, especially as we got closer to that October-November timeframe, we knew that La Nina winter was going to be problematic. And, you know, we don't have too many things in the meteorological or climatological world that always behave the way we anticipate them to do. And last winter pretty much played out exactly how not only the forecasts were showing, but what we were anticipating. And so, yes, as we were going into it, we were very concerned.
Yeah, and similarly for fire, we noticed the signal, and our biggest concern was it had been a dry period for the Southwest, and extending that into the winter, we knew that we had to have a good precipitation winter across the Southwest Four Corners region to prevent a potentially bad fire season this year, and we didn't get it. And like I said, a lot of those areas that did get snow were snow-free as early as early March, and that just gave a couple of extra months for those fuels to dry out and become receptive to fire. So yes, a La Nina signal is never a good signal for the Southwest.
Right, and to follow on to that, there was another question, just trying to confirm that the predicted El Nino conditions bring more rain and moisture to this region.
Yes, in most instances, El Nino will typically bring wetter than normal conditions along the west coast and into the southwestern U.S. all the way into South Texas. But it has to, I guess my flag of concern on that is over the last decade, we have had several El Nino and La Nina situations that did not, quote unquote, behave the way they had in the past, or even behaved completely opposite of what was expected. So yes, we can put hope in El Nino bringing some relief, but it still has to materialize, and it still needs to behave as past El Nino events have, with that wetter than normal signal.
And in terms of fire, these kinds of things are a double-edged sword for fire because you've had prolonged drought, so there's a lot of stress in the forest. But if you get a period of precipitation that stimulates growth in the fine fuels, grasses and brush, you increase the potential for a lot of fuel loading that once it does cure out the following spring and summer, it just adds to the fuel loading that can carry fire. So it's not always the precipitation that ends or mitigates droughts isn't always a good thing for fire.
Okay, we have time for one last question that came in. And that question is that they noticed, Dr. Fuchs, that you were using climate data normals from 1961 to 90, and they're wondering, is there a reason that you weren't using the 1980 to 2010 data?
For the one graphic that I showed of the normal precipitation for the West, and I was comparing those numbers, that was a late edition graphic, and it was the first one I found on a Google search, and it worked for me. And yes, you're right, there are new normals that are out there, but that was the only graphic that I was using the old normals on. Any of the other departure or percent of maps, as well as the SPIs, were with new normals.
Okay, excellent, thanks. So now I'm going to pass it over to Andrea Baer with NOAA. Andrea? Well, she was going to thank both of our presenters today, and also to mention that our next call will be June 25th, and we'll be sending information out about that. And the last question is, can we make the graphics available? Yes, they will be available online. Expect a message from Elizabeth Waite. And thank you very much to the presenters and to everyone who called in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Yes,
everyone.
thank you.